Welcome to Inner Cycle. Did you know your hand is a biomechanical masterpiece of 27 bones and intricate physics? Welcome to the ultimate masterclass. The human hand is arguably the most sophisticated biomechanical tool in existence. When electrical signals from the brain instantly translate into flawless physical precision, it happens mid-sentence, mid-keystroke, mid-grip. You are typing or gripping a pen or holding a guitar string down against the fret, and without warning, one finger simply stops listening to you. It curls inward, rigid, locked, sending a sharp jolt of pain shooting up toward your knuckle. And no matter how hard you try to consciously straighten it, it refuses. You can see the muscle bunched and hard beneath the skin. You can feel it. And yet the part of your brain responsible for voluntary movement, the part that has successfully commanded this exact finger to move 10,000 times today already, suddenly has no authority over it at all. This is the paradox we are taking apart today. A muscle cramp feels like a malfunction of the muscle itself, a piece of meat simply seizing up like an overworked engine. But that explanation, the one most people walk around believing their entire lives, is largely wrong. A cramp is not primarily a muscle problem. It is a communication breakdown, a corrupted signal traveling through one of the most elegant relay systems in the human body, the system connecting your spinal cord, your motor neurons, and the muscle fibers themselves. To understand why your finger locks up, you cannot simply look at the muscle. You have to look at the entire chain of command that tells that muscle what to do, and discover exactly where, under stress, that chain of command breaks.
Every voluntary movement you have ever made, from typing this sentence to throwing a ball, begins with a single cell called a motor neuron, a long, thin nerve cell whose body sits in your spinal cord, and whose tail, called an axon, can stretch for over a meter, reaching all the way down your arm and into your hand. A single motor neuron does not control just one muscle fiber. It branches out at its very end and connects to a cluster of individual muscle fibers simultaneously. And this entire package, one motor neuron plus every muscle fiber it touches, is called a motor unit. In large, powerful muscles like your thigh, a single motor neuron might control 1,000 muscle fibers at once, sacrificing precision for raw force. But in the small, intricate muscles of your fingers, a single motor neuron might control as few as 10 to 20 fibers, an arrangement built specifically for fine, delicate control rather than power. This is the very first clue as to why your fingers are uniquely vulnerable to cramping. They are wired with an unusually dense, unusually sensitive network of motor units, packed into an extremely small space, all firing rapidly and precisely during tasks like typing or playing an instrument. When your brain decides to bend a finger, it does not send a single simple pulse. It sends a rapid train of electrical signals down the motor neuron, and the rate at which these signals fire determines how forcefully the muscle contracts. This is called rate coding. A slow, infrequent train of signals produces a gentle, weak contraction. A rapid, sustained train of signals produces a strong, sustained contraction. The connection point where that nerve signal finally meets the muscle fiber is a microscopic structure called the neuromuscular junction. And this junction is genuinely one of the most beautifully engineered pieces of biological wiring in your entire body. When an electrical signal races down the motor neuron and reaches its very tip, it triggers the release of a chemical messenger called acetylcholine into a tiny gap between the nerve ending and the muscle fiber, a gap so small it is measured in nanometers. That acetylcholine diffuses across the gap in a fraction of a millisecond and binds to receptors on the muscle fiber's surface, triggering an electrical change in the muscle cell itself, which then races along the muscle fiber's membrane and dives deep into the fiber's interior through a network of tunnels called T-tubules.
This is where the actual mechanical work begins.
That electrical signal, now deep inside the muscle fiber, triggers the release of calcium ions from an internal storage structure called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium floods the interior of the cell and binds to a regulatory protein, exposing binding sites on a long protein filament called actin. A second protein filament, myosin, equipped with tiny molecular arms, immediately begins grabbing onto those exposed sites and ratcheting along the actin filament, pulling it inward in a microscopic tug-of-war that physically shortens the muscle fiber. Multiply this single contraction by the millions of fibers inside your finger's flexor muscles, all firing in near-perfect synchrony, and the result is the simple, smooth bend of a finger curling around a pen. Under normal conditions, when the nerve signal stops, the calcium is rapidly pumped back into storage, the myosin arms release their grip on actin, and the muscle relaxes, ready for the next command. A cramp is what happens when this release step fails. The muscle fiber stays locked in that contracted, ratcheted state, myosin still gripping actin, calcium still flooding the cell's interior, the entire fiber rigid and immovable, even though your conscious brain is now actively, urgently trying to send the opposite signal to let go.
It is worth pausing on just how much coordination is required for this system to work correctly even once, let alone the hundreds of thousands of times your fingers flex and release in an ordinary week. Your brain is not micromanaging individual muscle fibers one at a time. That would be computationally impossible given the sheer number of fibers involved. Instead, it relies on a principle called orderly recruitment, where smaller, more easily excitable motor units fire first for delicate tasks, and larger, more powerful motor units are only recruited as additional force becomes necessary. This is why you can gently touch a key on a keyboard with a feather-light tap, and then, a moment later, slam your fist on a table with tremendous force, using fundamentally the same muscle group, but recruiting an entirely different population of motor units to do it. This elegant, layered recruitment system works beautifully under normal conditions, but it also means that during prolonged, repetitive, fine motor tasks like typing or gripping a small object for hours, the same small subset of highly sensitive motor units gets activated again and again and again, with very little rest, while the larger, more fatigue-resistant units sit mostly idle. This uneven workload, concentrated entirely on the most delicate, most easily destabilized portion of the motor unit pool, is the deeper structural reason fingers are uniquely susceptible to this kind of involuntary lock.
You are issuing a command for relaxation, and somewhere in this chain, from spinal cord to motor neuron to neuromuscular junction to calcium release, that command is being overridden or simply lost. To understand exactly where that breakdown happens and why your fingers in particular seem to be a favorite target, we need to go deeper into the cellular substrate itself, into the chemistry of fatigue, and into the surprising history of researchers who discovered that the real source of a cramp was never inside the muscle at all. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation for muscle cramps was almost entirely chemical, and it centered on a single culprit: dehydration and electrolyte loss. The theory was straightforward and intuitive. Sweat heavily during exercise, lose sodium, potassium, and magnesium along with that sweat, and the muscle fiber's internal electrochemical balance becomes disrupted enough to trigger involuntary, sustained contraction. This theory still holds genuine truth, and we will return to it, but it has a serious problem. It cannot fully explain why a violinist's fingers cramp mid-performance in an air-conditioned concert hall, having lost no meaningful sweat at all, or why a programmer's fingers seize up after 6 hours of typing without a single drop of perspiration anywhere near the hand. Something else had to be happening, and finding it required researchers to stop looking exclusively at the muscle fiber and start looking at the nerve. In the 1990s, exercise physiologist Martin Schwellnus, working extensively with endurance athletes, began compiling evidence that pointed toward an entirely different mechanism, now widely known as the altered neuromuscular control theory. The core insight was this: cramping correlates far more strongly with muscle fatigue than with fluid or electrolyte loss alone. Inside your spinal cord, there are two competing types of sensory feedback constantly regulating a motor neuron's firing rate. Muscle spindles, tiny stretch receptors embedded within the muscle itself, send signals that excite the motor neuron, encouraging further contraction. Golgi tendon organs, located where muscle meets tendon, send the opposite signal, an inhibitory message that tells the motor neuron to ease off, protecting the tendon from excessive force. Under normal, well-rested conditions, these two systems exist in a stable, balanced negotiation. But under conditions of extreme fatigue, repetitive strain, or sustained, unusual finger positioning, like curling your hand around a pen at an awkward angle for hours, this balance can tip dramatically. Excitatory signals from the muscle spindles begin to dominate, inhibitory signals from the Golgi tendon organs weaken, and the motor neuron becomes hyperexcitable, firing in rapid, sustained bursts entirely on its own, independent of what your conscious brain is actually commanding.
This is the real mechanism behind a cramp. Not a muscle quietly breaking down, but a spinal reflex circuit becoming destabilized and firing uncontrollably, flooding the neuromuscular junction with signal after signal, holding the muscle in a locked, ratcheted contraction that your voluntary commands simply cannot override, because they are now competing against an involuntary reflex loop happening one level below conscious control. This discovery explains something that the old dehydration theory never could: why static stretching works so quickly and so reliably to break a cramp. When you forcibly stretch a cramping muscle, you are not flushing out lactic acid or replenishing lost electrolytes in any meaningful time frame. That chemical process takes far longer than the seconds it takes for a stretch to provide relief.
None of this means the electrolyte theory is worthless, and this is where the two explanations actually merge into a single, coherent picture. Sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium are not just generic minerals floating in your blood. They are the literal physical substrate that every electrical signal in this entire chain depends on. Low magnesium, in particular, has been closely linked to cramping because magnesium acts as a natural regulator of calcium channels, helping calcium re-enter storage properly after a contraction. When magnesium runs low, calcium can linger inside the muscle fiber longer than it should, making the actin-myosin lock harder to release, even after the nerve signal itself has calmed down. Magnesium's role here is worth examining a bit more closely because it operates at two separate points in this chain simultaneously, which is part of why its deficiency has such an outsized effect on cramping frequency.
At the neuromuscular junction itself, magnesium ions partially compete with calcium ions for entry into the nerve terminal, meaning adequate magnesium levels naturally dampen the release of acetylcholine, keeping the initial nerve-to-muscle signal appropriately moderate rather than excessive. Separately, deep inside the muscle fiber, magnesium is required as a cofactor for the very enzyme that pumps calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum after each contraction, the pump responsible for actually ending the contraction once the nerve signal has passed. When magnesium is scarce, both of these regulatory checkpoints weaken at once. The initial signal becomes slightly more excessive, and the cleanup process that ends each contraction becomes slower and less efficient, a double vulnerability that compounds rather than simply adds together. Dehydration concentrates electrolytes unevenly across cell membranes, subtly altering the resting voltage of nerve and muscle cells alike, making the entire system, from motor neuron to neuromuscular junction to muscle fiber, generally more excitable and more prone to that runaway reflex loop in the first place. So the honest, complete picture is this: fatigue and repetitive strain destabilize the spinal reflex circuit, making the motor neuron hyperexcitable, while poor hydration and electrolyte imbalance lower the threshold at which that instability tips over into a full, sustained, involuntary cramp. Neither factor alone tells the whole story. Together, they explain almost everything. And this also explains, with surprising precision, why your fingers specifically are such common victims. Recall that finger muscles are controlled by an unusually dense network of small motor units, built for fine control rather than raw power. Packed into an extremely confined space within the forearm and hand. This density means finger muscles experience an enormous number of nerve signals per unit of muscle tissue during repetitive, sustained tasks like typing, writing, or gripping an instrument for hours. More signals firing through a smaller, more tightly packed circuit means more opportunity for that delicate spinal balance between excitation and inhibition to tip over into instability. Your fingers are not weak. They are simply wired with extraordinary precision. And extraordinary precision, it turns out, comes with a genuine cost in resilience under sustained fatigue. Schwellnus and the researchers who followed him did not arrive at this theory through abstract speculation. They arrived at it by systematically testing predictions the old dehydration model simply could not make. If cramping were purely a fluid and electrolyte problem, then athletes who cramped during a given event should consistently show measurably lower blood sodium or more severe dehydration than athletes who did not cramp during that same event. Repeated studies, including detailed work on marathon runners and triathletes, failed to find this consistent difference. What they found instead was a far stronger, more reliable correlation with prior muscle fatigue, with athletes who had trained less, raced at a higher relative intensity for their fitness level, or pushed through unusually long durations being dramatically more likely to cramp, regardless of how hydrated or well supplemented they were. This kind of result, a theory failing its own predictive test, while a competing theory consistently succeeds, is precisely how scientific consensus is supposed to shift, and it is exactly why the altered neuromuscular control theory has become the dominant explanatory framework in modern sports medicine and physiology over the past 3 decades. Knowing all of this, the practical question becomes simple. What do you actually do in the moment when a finger locks up? And more importantly, what can you do beforehand to prevent that spinal reflex loop from destabilizing in the first place? The immediate fix, as we now understand, is mechanical, not chemical. The instant a finger cramps, gently but firmly pull it backward into extension, stretching the contracted flexor muscle along the palm side of your hand and forearm. This directly loads the Golgi tendon organs at the tendon, triggering the inhibitory reflex that overpowers the runaway motor neuron signal, and most finger cramps release within 10 to 20 seconds of sustained stretch. Resist the instinct to simply shake the hand or wait it out passively. The stretch is doing real, targeted neurological work that passive waiting cannot replicate nearly as quickly. Light massage of the cramped muscle belly can help as a secondary measure, increasing local blood flow and providing additional sensory input that can further compete with the hyperexcitable signal. But the stretch remains the primary, fastest intervention available to you. Prevention requires addressing both halves of the mechanism we have uncovered. On the fatigue and neural stability side, the single most effective intervention is simply breaking up sustained, repetitive finger postures. The motor neuron pool controlling your fingers becomes progressively more excitable the longer it fires in a continuous, unbroken pattern, which is precisely why cramping tends to strike during marathon typing sessions, long instrumental practice runs, or extended periods of tightly gripping a steering wheel or tool. Brief pauses, even 30 seconds of opening and closing the hand every 20 or 30 minutes, allow the excitatory and inhibitory signals at the spinal level to rebalance before they ever reach a critical, unstable threshold. On the electrolyte side, adequate magnesium intake deserves particular attention beyond the more commonly discussed sodium and potassium, given its specific, direct role in helping calcium channels reset properly after each contraction. Foods like leafy greens, nuts, and whole grains provide it reliably, and consistent hydration throughout the day, rather than only during intense activity, keeps the resting electrical threshold of your nerve and muscle cells stable rather than artificially lowered. What it was never specifically built for is the modern demand of holding a single, narrow, repetitive posture, the exact same finger angle, the exact same grip pressure, for hours at a stretch, with almost no variation at all. A keyboard, a steering wheel, a violin's fingerboard, all of these are recent inventions, evolutionarily speaking, asking an ancient, exquisitely sensitive motor system to do something profoundly unnatural, stay still, repetitively, for far longer than the spinal circuitry regulating it was ever designed to sustain without periodic rebalancing. What makes this entire mechanism worth sitting with is how thoroughly it dismantles the intuitive story most people carry around about their own bodies. A cramp feels like betrayal from within, like the muscle itself has simply broken down under strain, a piece of failed machinery. But the actual story is more interesting, and in some ways more unsettling. The muscle fiber is doing exactly what it was told to do.
It is faithfully, mechanically executing a command, gripping actin with myosin precisely as instructed. The actual malfunction is happening one level up, in a spinal reflex circuit you have no conscious access to, no ability to directly monitor, and no voluntary control over whatsoever. Your finger is not disobeying you. A piece of your own nervous system, operating entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness, is simply overruling you, issuing a competing, more forceful command than the one your deliberate, conscious mind is sending. The dam holding back this command is not in your finger at all. It is in your spine. There is a strange comfort buried in understanding a problem at this level of mechanical precision. A cramp stops feeling like a random, hostile betrayal by your own body and starts looking instead like a predictable, almost logical consequence of a specific, identifiable circuit being pushed past its operating limits.
The same way an overloaded electrical breaker trips, not out of malice, but out of a built-in safety threshold being crossed. The breaker has not failed. It has done exactly what it was designed to do under those particular conditions. Viewed this way, a finger cramp is less a malfunction and more a warning light, a precise, localized signal telling you that one very specific, very small population of nerve cells has been asked to fire continuously for longer than its design tolerances comfortably allow. So the next time a finger locks up mid-task, sharp and rigid and seemingly disobedient, you now know what is actually happening underneath the skin. You know it is not a muscle simply running out of fuel. It is a tug-of-war between excitatory and inhibitory nerve signals, a spinal reflex circuit tipping out of balance, and a microscopic molecular lock between actin and myosin that a deliberate stretch, not willpower, is what finally breaks.
This same basic architecture, excitation and inhibition locked in constant negotiation, calcium acting as the molecular trigger, a reflex loop operating beneath conscious awareness, shows up again and again throughout the human nervous system, in everything from the knee-jerk reflex a doctor tests with a small rubber hammer to the postural muscles that keep you upright without a single conscious thought while you stand in line at a store. A finger cramp is, in this sense, a small, painful window into a much larger truth about how your body actually runs itself. Layer upon layer of fast, local, automatic decision-making happening continuously beneath the level of conscious thought, usually invisible, usually silent, and only becoming noticeable in the rare moment when one of those layers briefly loses its balance. If you made it this far, you now understand the real electrochemical engineering behind something nearly everyone experiences and almost no one actually understands. Leave a comment below and tell us, did you already know cramps were a nerve problem and not just a muscle problem? Or is this the first time the real mechanism finally clicked? Subscribe for the next deep dive into the hidden machinery running your body without your permission, and we will see you in the next one.